From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, this is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Westin. We start with the markets today as they struggle to try to keep forward momentum going, maybe because of some issues with China. And we have Kaylee Lyons here to explain it to us.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, David. It's a mixed picture for the equity markets today. Of course, we are awaiting that supposed news conference coming from President Trump on the China issue. Investors don't seem too eager to put risk on the table ahead of that kind of unknown factor. So we're seeing the S&P 500 and the Dow lower by about 4 7/10% respectively. Actually, interestingly, the NASDAQ has flipped into positive territory, but only marginally. Now, of course, on top of the China issue, investors also have to consider today the pretty dismal consumer data we got earlier this morning, a record 13.6% drop in consumer spending in April. The consumer, of course, really the engine of the U.S. economy, as we know, so that weakness is weighing on sentiment a bit as well. We're seeing pretty broad-based declines in the S&P 500, but I want to highlight energy in particular. It is at the bottom of the barrel, down 1.6%, and part of that is those cyclical trades we saw at the beginning of the week unwinding as part of the risk-off sentiment, but you also have oil lower by about 0.8% today as well. But I want to stick on oil for just a moment longer, David, because even though it is lower today, it is still up in a massive way on the month. It has gained nearly 80% during May. The best month on record as that supply and demand dynamic in the market starts to look a little bit more balanced, and oil WTI is ending the month around $33 a barrel, David.
Okay, thank you so much to Kaylee Lyons. Well, we may be waiting to hear from President Trump. We've already heard from Fed Chair Jay Powell, just was talking a few minutes ago. And earlier today, our colleague Mike McKee sat down in an exclusive interview with Loretta Mester. She is the Cleveland Fed president. One of the things they talked about was yield curve control and whether that's something the Fed needs right now.
The yield curve is very flat at the short end. So maybe with the forward guidance we've given already, it's not necessary to do something to emphasize that forward guidance. But I don't want to take it off the table as something that's a potential for me to think about as a possible tool. I just don't see that we need it here in this space, nor do I see going forward that we necessarily would need to use it. But if we were to use it, I would view it as a reinforcement for forward guidance on the short end.
Okay, that was Loretta Mester, Cleveland Fed president, talking with Mike McKee. And now we have himself, Michael McKee, our chief economics and policy correspondent, with us. So, Mike, that was Loretta Mester. Let's talk about Chair Powell. He didn't necessarily talk so much about yield curve control, but he certainly tried to say, read my lips on negative rates.
Yeah, that's a message that they keep having to deliver to the markets, and I'm thinking they're probably getting a little bit annoyed at that. They tell us over and over again, we're not going to do negative rates, and people in markets don't believe them, but they have a history of giving in to what markets demand. So he had to come back and say once again, it's bad for the banks, it's bad for our money market system, and we also don't think that that'll work. So he poured more cold water on the idea of negative rates and went back to what the Fed has been saying all along its next tools move would be, forward guidance and using the QE process. Now, yield curve control is a little bit of a variation on that. Mester said she's not convinced yet, but it's certainly something they're looking at, which is what John Williams told us earlier this week.
He also talked about the real risk of a second wave of the virus and the fact that they might need some of those tools if that comes.
Yeah, I think that was one of the key takeaways here. He emphasized, as Mester did and others have, that the key to getting the economy back is going to be the confidence people have in going out, in shopping and spending money and going back to work, confidence that they're not going to get sick and die because they do that. And he's worried that if you had a second wave, the confidence, the beginning confidence that we're starting to see would go away rapidly, and that would have a major impact on the economy going forward.
Yeah, and finally, Michael, it's coming. It's really coming, this Main Street lending program. We keep hearing about it. He said, once again, it's a matter of days, right? Yeah,
they're going to change the name to the Godot lending program. But he says,
that's right.
He says by the end of the week, or in a few days, so I assume by the end of next week. The Fed's been worried about setting up an entire lending program from scratch that they do. Banks normally have relationships with their customers, with companies, especially non-public companies that aren't rated. They know whether they're good credits or not. Fed doesn't know if companies come to them whether or not to lend. So they've had to set up a system to figure that out, to see who's a good credit, what the price should be, and make sure they're going to get their money back, which is a requirement of the program.
Yeah, a whole new business for the Fed. Okay, thanks so much to Michael McKee. Great reporting there, and that interview this morning with Loretta Mester. In the meantime, here we're going to be talking to New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy about how big a struggle they have against the coronavirus and how big a budget hole he has to fill. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. Scientists are raising questions about a study published in the Lancet Medical Journal last week that linked anti-malarial drugs to increased heart risks and death among COVID-19 patients. A group of some 120 researchers is pointing out inconsistencies and asking for more details about the analysis. Researchers are skeptical of the death rates reported from Africa, and they say some of the doses used in the United States seem too high. In the UK, people are broadly abiding by the 10-week-old lockdown, but are still worried about contracting COVID-19. They are also increasingly fearful of losing their jobs. That's according to a new study for King's College London. It found 41% of adults left their homes fewer than 3 times in a 7-day period. 14% didn't leave home at all. Of those that stayed home, a majority said fear of catching the virus was a primary factor. South Africa says it has a backlog of nearly 100,000 unprocessed coronavirus tests. Health officials say there is a shortage of testing kits. Still, South Africa has conducted more tests for the virus than any other country in Africa, more than 655,000. Fewer than 2 million tests have been conducted across all of Africa, which is home to 1.3 billion people. There was a third night of violence in Minneapolis over the death of a black man in police custody. Hundreds of people protested and they set fire to a police station. President Trump tweeted that the demonstrators were thugs. He threatened to send in armed troops. That led to Twitter flagging the tweet, saying that it glorified violence. That was just hours after the president signed an executive order targeting Twitter and other social media. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Late yesterday, we sat down and talked with Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey about his state's battle against coronavirus and what lies ahead. Governor Phil Murphy, New Jersey has led in some ways in this pandemic, some ways in a good way with the number of cases, in some ways in not a good way. Tell us, as you start to reopen, what does New Jersey have to offer the rest of the country, for that matter, the rest of the world, in the smartest way to start to reopen now?
Listen, I'm not sure. I don't want to pat ourselves on the back. We've lost 11,401 blessed souls, so we've been pancaked. I hope what we can offer folks is that, some basic sort of themes, which is number one, public health creates economic health. In as much as we're all chomping at the bit to get everything opened again, if we transpose those steps or we jump the gun, I think we throw gasoline on the fire. And I think we've been very deliberate. And the second handed glove with that is we say all the time that data determines dates. So in as much as we don't ever want this to be abstract, in fact, we eulogize a handful of people every day. I call families every day to make sure it always stays personal. Having said that, this is Moneyball. This is what's the data telling us and what's that data allow us to do. And I hope that we get that right. So far, so good.
And in just about every one of those briefings that I've seen, at least, you also give credit to people in New Jersey for complying with the restrictions that are not easy to comply with. You mentioned chomping at the bit. People are chomping at the bit in New Jersey and elsewhere as well. As you start to back off, and it's not just an on-off switch, it's by measures, how do you ensure compliance? It's going to get harder and harder.
Yeah, it probably is, but I have to say both individuals, David, in terms of staying at home and staying away from each other and wearing face coverings, as well as businesses, both big and small, the compliance has been overwhelming relative to any expectation. Now, clearly, as the weather's gotten warmer, as the clock has continued to tick, as folks see other states that have been less hard hit than New Jersey and New York, as they, that's all human nature, and I get that. Are there more folks today than there were a month ago saying, I'm going to open on June something? Yeah, there are some more, but I will say this. And by the way, I think the other point I would make is that we've started to open up. We've not. This is not. We recognize that we need to take steps. We're going to, over the next few days, announce a whole lot more steps. For the most part, folks have done the right thing.
What about the politics of it within New Jersey? We've seen, at least in some other places, some other states, a fair amount of politics involved, where some people are really not just clamoring to get back, but really demonstrating, pretty active in it. What's been the politics in New Jersey? Do you have the legislature with you? Do you have the politicians backing you here?
Yeah, for the most part, we do. There's been some demonstrations. There's no question about it. Nothing at the scale that we've seen in a place like Michigan, for instance. But there have been pretty regular demonstrations, and I don't begrudge that. We never have. I would prefer folks did them virtually and that they don't congregate, but that bothers me more than the demonstrations. There's always exceptions with any legislature, but we've had a very good across the aisle give and take, generally strong support, and we've needed them. We need laws to get passed. We need to, for instance, we need an ability to borrow money to fill up the enormous budget hole that we have, as an example. But so far, so good. Again, there are some folks who naturally in any democratic reality are going to go off and say and do their own things. But for the most part, we've been in a good place.
One of the tricky things everyone is confronting is reopening of the schools. Fortunately, with the summer, most people are not going to school anyway, but you've got the fall coming up. It's a lot of uncertainty about how that's going to work. As you approach that question, what are the criteria you're going to use? What are the things you're considering about how and when to open your schools?
Yeah, we've promised folks by sort of mid-June, we're going to give them guidance, at least on pre-K through 12. And we're clearly talking to the universities and higher ed community constantly as well. And it's my bias, David, strongly is that we get back to school. We've done the virtual stuff as well as any American state, but there's for a whole host of reasons, including mental health, the richness of the experience. I want to see us back in school, but it's got to be a new normal. If you ask me a different question, but relatedly, what's the hardest nut to crack? I think it's going to be the young, healthy, asymptomatic, unwitting student who could pass this virus to an older educator, administrator, someone with underlying health challenges. That's got to be the one piece of this that we've got to get right. I think we can with social distancing, face coverings, maybe virtual instruction, even within in the bricks and mortar reality, but we got to make sure we get that right.
One of the things you've said is a particular challenge in New Jersey is long-term care facilities. It's not unique to New Jersey, but you've had a big issue with that. What are you doing about that? How can you really, going forward, sort of protect some of our elderly, some of the people with some of the underlying conditions?
Yeah, we've been clobbered in long-term care. We're not alone for sure, but of the 11,401 deaths, almost 5,000 of them are from long-term care facilities. And by the way, early on, what I just mentioned about schools, early on, that was sort of the spark that created the fire, the asymptomatic, unwitting, heroic, I might add, healthcare employee or loved one visiting and unwittingly passing it on. So we've thrown the kitchen sink at this, including at the uneven operator performance. The Attorney General's got an investigation outstanding. The National Guard, I'm very happy to say the President has just re-upped the funding to extend the National Guard. They're in a lot of our long-term care facilities. The Federal Veterans Administration has come in and helped us out, not just in our veterans homes, which have been hit, but also in other homes. We hired a nationally renowned firm. We're now in the process of universal testing and retesting, cohorting, separating patients positive from non-positive. We've learned a lot of lessons. That industry has learned a lot. We all have the hard way, unfortunately.
So first and foremost is a health issue, as you point out every single one of your briefings, as you put those photographs up of some of the people you've lost in New Jersey, but it's also an economic issue without a doubt. We are getting increasing numbers of unemployed, and that includes New Jersey. I think is it 1 in 9 now you're up to?
Yeah.
At what point do you expect this is going to bottom out? Do you see a bottom to this unemployment and it's starting to turn back around?
Please God, sooner than later. I think it's correlated with a couple of things, David. Number one, the continued responsible reopening, that we get that right, that we don't have, we're going down a one-way street. I don't want to turn the car around and go back the other way. And secondly, I'll give you a big game changer, and that is direct federal cash assistance to states and municipalities. It's talked about. There are a couple of bills, including Bob Menendez, one of our great senators, co-sponsor with a Republican colleague, Bill Cassidy in Louisiana, is a good example. Speaker Pelosi with the HEROES Act. We need that, not just a blue state, not just New Jersey. All American states need that. And frankly, that's the biggest potential accelerant that's available to us right now to reboot our economy and get as close to that long sought after V-shaped recovery. That's, to me, the biggest game changer available.
So give us a sense of those numbers, if you would. How much of that is just filling a hole, and how big is that hole? Because you lost a lot of revenue and had increased costs. And how much is really you need to reinvest in order to get things going?
Yeah, this is all about, let me give you a couple of numbers. We announced a budget at the end of last week for the next 4 months. So we extended our fiscal year to September 30. So we're talking about 4 months and a few days. We had to cut or defer well over $5 billion of expenses. Or put it differently, we said the revenue loss, as best we could tell, from June of 2020 until June 30th of 2021, over $10 billion. This is the difference between, but there's a certain myth out there, well, we're just going to help you all because you hadn't managed your legacy realities, your outstanding indebtedness or your structural deficits or your pension obligations. We were doing just fine with that. It's a long slog, but we were making a lot of progress. This is about keeping firefighters, police, EMS, healthcare workers, educators employed. Literally, the consequence, or the alternative, I should say, to not getting that funding is a whole lot of layoffs. We think as much as 200,000 more at the state level alone in New Jersey.
Boy, and what does that do to services in the state?
It would gut them. It would gut them at the very moment when we can least afford the services being gutted. Our residents need those workers more than ever, literally more than ever before. It's unfathomable, which is why I think the case is so compelling for that federal cash assistance.
Are there ways to make up some of the revenue shortfall in other ways? I know you've increased tolls, but I think that was specifically to do some road work. But are there tolls or license fees, taxes that you could get some more revenue?
Perhaps, David, but I do mean this. The hole is so significant from this, and it's not just New Jersey. I don't think there's any amount of cuts or any amount of taxes that comes close to filling the hole up. And we're already a state that is, not the cheapest place to live in America. People come here to raise a family. We have the #1 public education system in America, the best location of any state. We live on talent and location. This is one of these moments where the federal government plays that existential role that no one else can play. And we need that role to be played right now to its maximum.
What about some infrastructure spend? We've heard your brother, Andrew Cuomo, across the way in New York saying, let's advance some of the infrastructure spend.
I love that. The Gateway Tunnel is something that Governor Cuomo and I have been pounding away on. We think it's a game changer. It's a huge, this is building new tunnels under the Hudson River. The current ones were built in 1910. It's a new bridge on our side. It's reimagining Penn Station on the New York side. That's a great example. Good news is the Trump administration just forwarded $90-odd million on the New Jersey side of that. But infrastructure absolutely is a potential game changer. It employs a lot of folks. We're a proud union state. That's a good thing. We'll take that in absolutely as soon as possible.
Well, President Trump has said some nice things about you, despite the fact that you may be from opposite sides of the aisle. Have you talked to him about this? Have you gotten any encouragement from President Trump that actually that's a good idea? Because he said in the past he wants infrastructure in general.
Yeah, I mean, we speak pretty regularly, and we've spoken mostly about the obviously this pandemic of late. But we've absolutely spoken with him and his team up and down, Secretary of Transportation. No question, infrastructure is a I wouldn't say a magic bullet, but it's one of those levers. Listen, FDR pulled that lever in the 30s for a reason. And by the way, it's the other great thing is you not only get economic and activity and employment in the here and now, the great thing about infrastructure is it's there 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, and future generations benefit from it. It's not a wasting asset. So I think there's a lot of potential without question.
Yeah, if you talk about GDP growth, that's a quick way to get it, actually, if you build up your infrastructure as a practical matter. Finally, give us a sense out over the horizon. What sort of changes do you anticipate because of this pandemic for New Jersey? And I'll give you an example. Do you think that people, after this is over, whatever that means, will continue to commute in daily into Manhattan, or might that change some of those patterns?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know that any of us know the answer to that, but my guess is that we've been changed permanently. From the little but important stuff like social distancing and wearing face coverings to the bigger things. We've got a Restart and Recovery Commission that I announced a few weeks ago with some really incredible, wise women and men. Shirley Tillman, former president of Princeton, is a co-chair. Ken Frazier, CEO of Merck, is a co-chair. Ben Bernanke, former chair of the Federal Reserve. These are the sorts of questions they're wrestling with us. We got about 25 or 30% of our workforce that commutes to where they're going and could, if they choose to, stay at home. And most of them have done just that. I think there's a huge potential shift in that. You've got a whole other group of folks who have no choice but to be close to other coworkers or to the customer. I frankly think that experience will also change. But I think we're going to look back 5 or 10 years from now. And I know this is trite and people say it, but I think it's real. Just as we did, and you were in the thick of 9/11 in your prior life, we're going to look back 5 or 10 years from now, as we did 5 or 10 years after 9/11, and things that we maybe had never imagined were part of our lives, and we took them as a natural part of our life. I think the same thing will be true here.
Governor, if you will permit me, let me ask a personal question. How are you doing? I mean, it's not lost on me. The first day I think that you had a case in New Jersey, you were actually undergoing surgery, serious surgery. You came back too soon. We've watched you keep up this pace day after day after day. How is your health? How are you doing?
I appreciate your asking. I'm knocking on some wood here, David. So far, so good. You're absolutely right. I had some fairly major cancer-related surgery on my kidney on March 4th, and I literally went to the recovery room and got rolled into the my hospital bed, and I checked my phone, and literally the first text I got was from my chief of staff saying that we had our first positive case. We now have 158,000 positive cases. As I said, 11,401 fatalities. It's almost unfathomable, but so far so good. I'm better than I probably have any right to be, and I appreciate your asking.
New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy. And now we turn to Kaylee Lyons for today's Stock of the Hour.
Our stock of the hour is Simon Property Group, David. It's of course a REIT. It operates about 230 retail properties across the country. It's lower by about 5% today, extending the decline we've already seen this year. And really what's dragging it down is twofold. On the micro level, you had the consumer spending data for April that showed a record drop of 13.6%. But on a micro level, you have Nordstrom, one of its top tenants, reporting last night, and some interesting commentary on the call from the CEO, who said they need to start shifting away from malls, more towards digital, more toward off price. And of course, that isn't something you want to hear as a mall operator. And that points to a really poignant theme for me, David, which is how retail is going to look different coming out of this crisis. Because yes, we're starting to reopen. Simon Property has plenty of liquidity to get through these store closures, deal with the fact that it's not getting rents right now. But at the end of the day, there's going to be longer term ripple effects, perhaps permanent store closures, retail bankruptcies. None of that paints a very desirable picture for REIT, David.
Thank you so much to Kaylee Lyons for that Stock of the Hour. Coming up, we're going to talk with Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group about the problems between the United States and China as we wait for a news conference from President Trump this afternoon about possible sanctions. It's certainly affecting the markets. We'll find out from Ian Bremmer what lies ahead. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, earlier today, presidential advisor Larry Kudlow said that the United States is furious, to use his word, with China. And at 2 o'clock this afternoon, President Trump has now said he's going to tell us what form that fury may take with possible sanctions against China as he holds a news conference at the White House. We are joined now by Ian Bremmer. He is the president and the founder of Eurasia Group to take us through this. So, Ian, thank you so much for being here. Set the scene for us here. I mean, is this really about Hong Kong? Is that really what this is about, or is this about something much more broader and more geopolitical?
Let's be clear. If the Chinese took these steps against Hong Kong at any point with any administration, the U.S. would be reacting quite severely. But the fact that the Hong Kong decision comes at a time of grave economic crisis, of immense mistrust between the two countries, of a level of decoupling which is speeding up, of the integration that our two economies have, and that President Trump is running for re-election with over 100,000 dead for coronavirus, expecting the 6 to 8% contraction of the U.S. economy and over 40 million unemployed on the rolls in the last 2 months, and China being the most plausible proximate actor he can blame for this, aside from himself, you can understand why I'm not optimistic about the near-term trajectory of U.S. China relations.
So to some extent, President Trump is really looking at the election come November. What's President Xi looking at? I mean, is this really a long game for him, really playing for history? Or does he have his own domestic political issues where he's playing, in a sense, toward his base?
It's a longer game for Xi than it is for the United States president. That is true. But to keep in mind, Xi Jinping got rid of term limits in China. Normally, the president would be constrained by 2 terms. That's it. His second term, is up in 2022. And there are a number of senior leaders in Beijing I've spoken with who tell me that they're not so convinced that it's a layup for Xi in 2022. China is not Russia in that regard. And he has badly mishandled this crisis, at least in the early weeks, inside China, and is seen to have done so. And there's also been some mishandling of China's diplomacy, unartful at best, heavy-handed at worst, around the world, including with the United States. And if we end up in a Cold War with China, Xi Jinping will be seen domestically as somewhat responsible for that. So the decision to shut down Hong Kong and get rid of their autonomy and functionally end the one state, 2 systems rule that they've lived under for decades now, since 1997, is an immensely popular move for Xi inside mainland China and has to be seen in the broader context of the U.S. relationship and Xi's own domestic political interests.
So, Ian, let's make you National Security Advisor for the moment. And President Trump, as I say, is going to have a news conference at 2 o'clock this afternoon Eastern Time. What options are you laying before him? Because it looks like right now he's not going to get a lot of resistance from Democrats or Republicans up on the Hill.
There's no one out there that would be telling Trump to take it easy on China right now. In fact, given that he has Larry Kudlow and others that are continuing to cheerlead for the Phase 1 trade deal, and that Xi Jinping was a friend of Trump who he respected quite a bit, if he doesn't take it tough against the Chinese, he'd actually be vulnerable from the other side and saying, you're in the pocket of all these authoritarian leaders, including Xi Jinping. And there's no way Trump is going to be in that position. Now, what I would be advising Trump, and by the way, I expect that this is what he will do, is to sanction Chinese officials that have been directly involved in human rights activities, suppression in Hong Kong, that are involved in writing up this new legislation. I would consider taking steps against Hong Kong directly to put them more in line with China on things like export tariffs, where the American companies in Hong Kong are not so badly affected. But I would not, despite Secretary of State Pompeo's statement making very clear that autonomy no longer applies to Hong Kong, I would not end the special trade status that Hong Kong enjoys from the United States. And the reason I wouldn't do that is because that's going to dramatically affect all of the U.S. companies that are doing business in and through Hong Kong. And in this economic environment, I don't see why I'd want to take that risk.
Well, it seems to me exactly the right question, Ian, and certainly for people who are investing in Hong Kong or thinking about it. Is it possible for the United States to put enough pain to bear on Xi Jinping and on Hong Kong without damage the proposition to invest in Hong Kong? I mean, there are some people who even talk about curtailing banking activities with Hong Kong.
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand that the reason that Hong Kong is a global financial center is in part because of the regulatory environment favored as it is both from China and from the United States, and also because investor sentiment is quite convinced that that's going to remain the case going forward. So it's not only about regulation and laws, it's also about, do people believe it going forward? And I think that damage has already been done. I mean, you and I both know, we've spoken together about my belief that we're in a technology Cold War between the U.S. and China, and that was before coronavirus. That was last year. We also know that we are increasingly decoupling in other parts of our global supply chain, certainly around pharmaceuticals. Certainly we'll see that in vaccine deployment. Certainly we'll see that in lots of other places, manufacturing and services between the two countries. As that happens, even if the Americans maintain this trade status, you're going to see a lot of people voting with their feet, investors, bankers, leaving Hong Kong. And if they need to be doing business in China, they're going to go to Shanghai or Shenzhen. And if they don't need that so much, they're going to go to Singapore or maybe Tokyo or Seoul. And Hong Kong is going to get squeezed. And on the back of this, you're going to see more demonstrations and more violence, and the Chinese government will suppress it. And that means the middle class and the business class in Hong Kong will be less robust. So this is unwinding. The question, David, is how precipitously, how quickly. And there, Trump's response, which of course has to be linked to what kind of market damage do I want to do in the few months remaining before my election, which is what I care most about, much more than American national interests and security. It's the same way Trump's going to approach the phase one trade deal. If he's going to break it, he's much more likely to break it in the weeks coming up to the election than in the months, when you're already seeing job numbers, the trajectory start to look better, and when the economic impact, negative of it, will not have such a great playthrough on his own re-election campaign. So I think timing matters here in a lot of different ways.
So Ian, finally, connect something, if it is connected at all, and that is the dispute between India and China on that border. That's also flared up at this time. Is that a coincidence? What's going on?
I mean, there have been some fisticuffs between the two. There's been a lot of posturing. The Indians have been building more infrastructure in contested territory. The Chinese have sent additional troops into the region. I would say right now it's definitely a concern because the economies for both countries are going badly and because the leaders are feeling kind of vulnerable. But Modi's approval ratings right now are actually quite high. They're around 80%. And he's been seen as a strong leader in response to coronavirus, both on the lockdown as well as on general nationalism, even though his economic response has been weak, in my view, so far. Xi Jinping does not need near-term confrontation with the Indians to ensure the sanctity of his position. He doesn't really want a big fight with India. So I think skirmishing, showing face on both sides. I'd be really surprised if this blew up, frankly. And so worth monitoring as everything is in this environment. But of all of the geopolitical tensions out there, Russia versus Saudi Arabia and the U.S. on the oil war, the vaccine fight, the World Health Organization fight, plus everything you and I have just been talking about, India, China would not be on my top 10 right now.
Okay, Ian, thank you so much. That's Ian Bremmer. He's the founder and president of Eurasia Group. And I'm delighted to say Ian's going to be back with us in the second hour of Balance of Power because we have the rest of the world to talk about. In the meantime, coming up here, we're going to talk with internet law expert. He is Jeff Kosef about the proposal from the president to curtail social media. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Yesterday, President Trump signed an executive order that at least moves toward taking away some of the immunity, legal immunity, that social networks have enjoyed. The question is, can he go as far as he wants to go? We welcome now an expert on internet law. He is Professor Joseph Kosef. He is from the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. He's the author of the book, The 26 Words That Created the Internet. And I must say, he is here in his private capacity. He's not representing the U.S. Navy or the federal government. So this is his expertise, and he has a lot of it on this subject. So, Professor, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. I think we have to start with the Section 230 of what I think is called the Communications Decency Act of 1996, because that's what the president is focused on. What does that do?
So what Section 230 does is it says that if you're an online platform, if you're a website, a social media service, an app, you're responsible for the content that you create, but you're not going to be held legally responsible for content that users or other third parties put onto your platform. It provides a fairly strong legal immunity for claims such as defamation. So if I were to go on a website and post something defamatory, the person who I was posting about could sue me, but they're not going to succeed in suing the website because of Section 230.
Now, first of all, I want to get your name right. It's Jeff, it's not Joe, so I apologize for that, Professor.
Yes.
But let's go back to what's going on here, because as I understand it, Section 230 basically was about somebody posting something, putting something up affirmatively. But what really gave rise, apparently, to President Trump's problem is not that something he posted was, it's not that somebody posted something he objected to, but he put something up and then Twitter put something extra on top of that. Why does Section 230 apply to that at all?
Well, so Section 230 protects both the ability to take action and not take action regarding user content. So what Section 230 won't necessarily protect is if you create new content that in and of itself is defamatory. So if I give, in the example that I gave about a website, if the website then adds its own comments that in themselves are defamatory, those are not going to be protected by Section 230. But if a website decides to take down some of the defamatory comments and not all of them, that is something that Section 230 will protect. So it's basically giving, Section 230 gives these platforms the breathing room to make moderation decisions or not to make them.
So Section 230, as you say, is part of a statute passed by Congress, signed by the president. The initiative under the executive order, as I understand it, is regulatory in nature. How much authority does the executive branch have to modify or its enforcement of 230 without going back to Congress?
Well, I mean, I think that the broader issue here, and I mean, this has been going on for the past few years, is that there have been a lot of criticism of Section 230 from various points of view. Some people who say that the platforms do too much moderation, and others who say the platforms are not moderating enough and they leave up harmful content. And I mean, I think that all of this is laying the groundwork for efforts to repeal Section 230 altogether. I think there's what I've seen is there's a substantial amount of support on various sides of the political spectrum for a repeal of Section 230.
So, Professor, give us a sense of what that might do as a practical matter. In 1996, there were tens of millions of people on the internet. Now there are billions of people globally. If you took that back away, what would happen to social media? Could it survive in that environment if it were liable to be sued for things posted by other people?
Well, so we don't exactly know how social media and other platforms would react to a full repeal of Section 230 because the modern internet has always existed with Section 230 in place. There are a few different options. One possibility is that platforms might be a lot more restrictive about what user content they allow because they're just afraid of being held liable for every word that users post. However, there actually is a line of cases before Section 230 was passed, actually really just one substantial case, where the court suggested that you actually increase your First Amendment protections if you don't do any moderation at all. So it's hard to say with any certainty because, again, we've just always had Section 230. But there is a chance that platforms either just might not moderate or they might not allow much user content at all just because of the fear of liability. But the current platforms and how they operate, for good or bad, really have based their business models around Section 230 as pretty robust protections.
Okay, Professor, really appreciate your time and your expertise today. That's Professor Jeff Kosef of the U.S. Naval Academy. Coming up here, we're going to talk about that tragic situation in Minneapolis with former Minnesota Senator Norm Coleman. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. As we said earlier in the program, our colleague Mike McKee got an exclusive interview with Loretta Mester. She's the Cleveland Fed president earlier today. And besides talking about yield curve control, they also talked about what's coming up in the rest of the year, like the second quarter. This is what she said.
The second quarter numbers, when they come out, are going to be very, very negative numbers. I mean, we know that. We know that that was the height of the shutdown when there was no activity. In the third quarter and fourth quarter, we're going to see activity begin to emerge. I think some of the quarterly growth rates are going to overstate what it looks like really out in the field, because we're going to see from a base of very little activity, some pickup in activity, and they're going to look like big growth rates. But we're still going to be below where we were at the start of the year in terms of both employment and output. When you have so many people out of work, it's hard to imagine that we'd see a quick V-shaped recovery. I think it's going to be slow. I think businesses are going to be thoughtful about reopening. I think people are going to be thoughtful about spending. And so what that means is that monetary policy has a role to play as we support the economy, getting back to our dual mandate goals of full employment and price stability. And so that's more traditional monetary policy, and the tools that we have are our interest rate tool, which already is at zero, forward guidance, which we've used before, and also asset purchases, but asset purchases not to improve market functioning, but really to support the economy as it moves forward towards full employment and price stability.
Well, President Mester, at the moment, there are people worried about how big the Fed's role is in clearing markets now and how big the Fed's role is in setting prices. And there's been a conversation in the last several weeks with us and your colleagues, including President Williams, about yield curve control. I want to try and understand from you, because this is where the confusion is on Wall Street for some people in fixed income at the moment. Would yield curve control for you be something focused on the front end to the belly of the Treasury curve? Or would you think about doing what Japan is doing, which is all the way out to 10 years? Just how much control over the yield curve, so to speak, would you be looking to have?
Right. So my view of yield curve control is that it really is a support for forward guidance if we were going to do it. Now, the committee has discussed yield curve control as a tool back in 2010 during the financial crisis, and then also as part of our framework review as a tool, a potential tool. No decisions have been made on that at all. Again, I don't think of that as something that would be in this phase of what we're doing to make sure that the markets continue to function. But as a tool, I think it's worthwhile thinking about what those tools are going to be that we can use. But right now, that's a discussion for the future phase. And my own view is that if you wanted to do it, you'd have to think hard about how you would implement it. And also, as I said before, how do you exit from it? Because with any of these tools, right, there are pros and cons of using them. Right now, as you point out, the yield curve is very flat at the short end. So maybe with the forward guidance we've given already, it's not necessary to do something to emphasize that forward guidance. But I don't want to take it off the table as something that's a potential for me to think about as a possible tool. I just don't see that we need it here in this phase, nor do I see going forward that we necessarily would need to use it. But if we were to use it, I would view it as a reinforcement for forward guidance on the short end.
Before we let you go, I have to ask you about this. There is the possibility we could end up in a new trade war with China, additional tariffs going on. How would that affect the economy? Have we already absorbed that, or would that be a new hit to the economy now?
Well, I think, whenever there's a new rising up of uncertainty, and this is another uncertainty, I think we have to take it on board as being another potential headwind to a recovery. So I think we have to just use that as part. We have to take the conditions as they are. I think that we played this game before and sort of saw how the uncertainty did dampen the expansion earlier. And so I think we had to just take that on board as this is another uncertainty added to an incredible amount of uncertainty we already have.
That was Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester talking with our colleague Michael McKee and John Farrow earlier today. I'm delighted to say we have Michael McKee back now. He is our Chief Economic and Policy Correspondent. So Mike, the thing I'd really like to focus on with Loretta Mester and what she said about buying assets to really help the economy, not really to affect the market. And also we heard from Fed Chair Jay Powell saying, you know, we will insert money, but it's for lending, it's not for spending. Is that really a difference? Does that difference hold up? They're making a big effort to say we're really not doing sort of monetization.
Yeah, they want to make it clear that we need more fiscal help, that Congress needs to do something to help stimulate the economy. The Fed can lower interest rates, and they're doing these lending programs, but they are lending programs. In theory, they're supposed to be paid back. And the Fed, by statute, can't lose money, which is why the Treasury participates in this. If anybody loses anything, it'll be the taxpayers. But they want to make it clear that we need more stimulus. The Fed will probably do something to keep interest rates lower. But if you really want to get money into the hands of people and get them out spending, that's got to come on the fiscal side.
Well, that's part of the issue, isn't it? Because we heard from Fed Chair Powell that a lot of the issue, particularly if there's a second wave, is going to be consumer confidence. I'm not sure the Fed can make the consumer feel better.
No, if you're worried about catching coronavirus and dying, you're not going to really go out and buy something because the interest rate on it is about 10 basis points lower. So the Fed has done about all they can do in this case to lower interest rates, lower the cost of money. Their next steps would be to keep that cost of money lower and maybe to boost the stock market in the hope that the wealth effect would trickle down to people and they would feel like they could go out and spend. That was the original purpose of QE. They say that's not what they're doing now, but they could aim it that way.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that as they sort their way through this thing, they may actually be helping fiscal stimulus in a way by keeping the rates low because the Treasury can borrow money cheaper.
It all fits together. If the Treasury can borrow money more cheaply, then they might be more encouraged to do so, to spend money. We know that the Republicans who've worried about the budget have now expressed concerns about spending more money. So reassuring them would at least help in perhaps getting their vote for a fourth round of aid.
Okay, thank you so much to Michael McKee for 2 appearances today on Balance of Power. It was a real treat to have you, Mike. In the meantime, there is a headline as we go to break here. It says that President Trump is weighing sanctions on China finance sector over Hong Kong, something that has been rumored but really would be quite dramatic potentially about Hong Kong. That does it for Balance of Power on television. We're going to go over to radio now and have a second hour. This is Bloomberg.